And so this could be used to the study of the bacterial spores, so we can learn about the mechanical properties of the layers that form the spore. So this is the outer view. This is like a cross-section view. So if you cut it, there's a genetic material actually is at the bottom, and then there are layers, protective layers around it. It's so important for this organism that it came up with this really tough coat structure. And so we can put this under our microscope and we can image. So what we did is, after our imaging results, we measure how rigid or how compliant it is. Together with collaborators, we came up with this model that if you have a layered material, this could be paint on the wall, this material can actually delaminate. If you try to compress it, the forces will create some kind of instability that would lead to like a blister, for example. That kind of a mechanism could explain how those wrinkles are formed, and we use theoretical models and then measurements to determine whether this can explain what we see. And you can put this in a simulation. You don't have to use pen and paper to calculate. You can do a little better than that because this is more complicated. But a simulation can actually predict how this shape can emerge. You can start from a round initial structure, and if it shrinks, it will cause these wrinkles to emerge. And as the spore goes through its life, every day, for example, humidity will change, spore will expand and shrink. These wrinkles will help the spore to accommodate that size change. Moisture can create damage, right? If you have a wooden furniture, when you put in a dry environment and a humid environment, you can form cracks. For this organism, that would be damaging because it has genetic material that it needs to protect. And this coat layer, because it's accordion-like, it gains flexibility. It uses actually a really tough and rigid material, but because of these folds and wrinkles, it becomes more flexible. So during this study, something caught my attention. So we measured the property, right? This is mechanical properties like stiffness. You can measure and quantify, and you can compare different materials. One parameter is elastic modulus. It tells you how stiff the material is. Rubber is very compliant. Steel is quite rigid in that scale. And most of the polymers are in units of a gigapascal. That's something you represent the stiffness with. These spores are comparable to the plastic materials, and for such a material to expand and contract with humidity, that would require a lot of energy. And that's quite unusual for an organism to have. And I wanted to look more closely. First of all, measure how much energy they can pack, because they can change their shape when they go into a dry place and then when they go into a humid place. So basically, this cartoon would illustrate that. So spores in a dry condition, they have a small diameter. If water goes in because of moisture, they get bigger. It's exaggerated, they get bigger 10% or so, but that's quite a big energy in it. And then if you put them back into a dry environment, they will shrink. And this is reversible, so they can go back and forth. So we used our atomic force microscope again. We repurposed it, this time to apply some force to the spore. You can imagine the spore as a really tiny sponge. Imagine that it has little pores and cavities in it, but they're really small, close to the atomic dimensions. And this sponge behaves in this unique way. It can absorb moisture and get bigger. If we use this diving board like cantilever, if we press on it, we can actually push out some water. And if this is already in a dry condition and then you increase humidity, the spore will actually like to take water, and it will take it and it will actually push that cantilever up. It will do work. It will basically lift something that's already pushing on it really hard. You can create something called a thermodynamic cycle. You can start in a dry condition, push on it, increase the humidity, make it moist, and then spore pushes. Reduce the force, put it back to the dry condition, you get back to where you started, and this creates a cycle, and during the cycle it displaces and it applies force, and you get this curve. The area inside the curve is work, and you can measure and quantify that, and you can compare it with other materials. And that comparison is actually is in this graph. I would like to point, these are the experimental measurements of the different species, the spores formed by different species. And what you have in this graph is how much energy is packed in a given volume. And the horizontal axis is how much size change they generate when they go from dry to humid. These other points on the graph are known materials. Engineers use a lot of materials to move objects, and they are also, they characterize them well, so these numbers are known for those materials. This is mammalian skeletal muscle. It can actually, it's very good, it can expand by 20% in length, and that's very useful, and that's how we move. But most engineering materials are not good from that perspective, and engineers who design, for example, robots, they have a challenge to make things move. All right, so this quantity is valuable because if you want to lift something, and if you have a limited space to make, for example, a device, the more energy is packed, the better it is. And so this is amazing because this graph is, mathematically, the difference between them is huge, and you can do a lot with that. To give you an example, if you have a pound of dry spores, and if you add moisture to it, this is the kind of work it can do. Imagine you have a car that weighs roughly a ton. You can lift it about a meter if this material is 1 pound. That's what those numbers were telling us. We don't have such a material in the lab right now, but that individual spore has that capability. If we could actually make one, that could be possible. But there are a lot of challenges from going from one spore to something that's a pound that works in the same way. The basic principle behind this, and this is actually going back to the tree example I mentioned in the beginning. If you put water in between surfaces, it can behave differently. This phenomenon is